Hello and welcome to Frankly, which is our weekly dive into national security issues with Frank Figliuzzi. Of course, Frank Figliuzzi, a former assistant director of the FBI and MSNBC contributor, also author of The FBI Way and Hunting the Highway Serial Killers, available for pre-order. Frank, this is obviously, with everything in the news, national security is on everybody's mind, or is it?
Well, if it isn't, it should be more than it is these days. But you know what I'm going to enjoy about our discussions as we do this weekly, Chip, is that I see almost everything through a security lens. That's just who I am. Whether it's domestic security or not, I'll find and we'll discuss with our viewers and listeners how security is just pervasive through everything we're looking at, from the Trump trial to what's going on, of course, with Gaza, Israel, Hamas. We'll cover all of that, and maybe some eyes will be opened about what constitutes a security concern these days.
I mean, it's funny, too, because when I think about, I grew up, as many did, in the 80s with the prospect of nuclear weapons. I remember as a kid hearing the 11 a.m. in Alexandria, Virginia, the 11 a.m. siren go off every Tuesday to remind us about, air raid drills. And, growing up near the Pentagon, I remember when I was a small child and the missile crisis in Cuba, my mom actually tried to build a bomb shelter. We were 2 miles from the Pentagon. The irony of I guess that most Americans don't really understand the threats to us, the national security threats. And it can be, infrastructure as well, too. There's a lot of things. And you and I were joking the other day about, we'll talk about this. Let's get our guest in here. David Sanger is the Pulitzer Prize winning chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times. He's also author of The Perfect Weapon and his new book, which is out, is New Cold Wars. And he joins us on Frankly. David, good to see you again.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me. And, I was just thinking, if you live 2 miles from the Pentagon, there's no bomb shelter deep enough you could dig.
Yeah. And my mom was pretty smart. She worked for the Justice Department. And so she had a good idea. But I think most people will just, and this is interesting when these times happen, people want something to do in these moments of angst and worry, something that at least gives them the sense of that they're not just victims, and we've had this. Before we get into New Cold Wars, and I looked at it kind of as an extension of The Perfect Weapon, and this is something Frank does so well too. The story, you had a story in there in one of the interviews you did when you were recanting Randall Stevenson, who was then the CEO of AT&T, and his visit with Trump, and just the buffoonery that came out of the meeting reminds me a little bit of Michael Lewis's story from The Fifth Risk, when Trump was in Trump Towers and the King of Egypt came on and he started telling him how much he loved Walk Like an Egyptian. This is right after he'd been elected. Oh, you don't know that story? Oh, it's insane. Chris Christie tells it. He says that he's listening to him on the phone. He goes, I really like that song, Walk Like an Egyptian. And this is 3 minutes into a congratulatory call from King of Egypt.
Oh, God.
Let me ask both of you guys, and with New Cold Wars in the backdrop here, what is the greatest national security risk to the United States today, and which country might it come from?
Which one of us do you want to start with?
Well, David, it's your book, so tell us.
So this goes beyond the book a little bit. I deal with it a little bit at the end, because New Cold Wars is the story of how we got diverted from superpower conflict for 20 years while we were doing counterterrorism and so forth. And there are, as you guys were just discussing, many different threats. I think right now the biggest single threat comes from us. It comes from our own divisions, and it comes from our own inability to debate large strategic issues. And let me just give you an example that I've been discussing on the road. Because of the book tour I've been in this past week in San Francisco and Dallas and Chicago, places that are all of considerably different politics. But a point that everybody seemed to agree on, I made the observation that if you go back to the Kennedy-Nixon debates and you turn off the video so you're not distracted by who looked young and who looked like they were sweating and all that, and you just listen to the quality of the debate about what it takes to deter a major superpower, whether it was nuclear deterrence or building ourselves up at home or whatever. No matter what your politics were in 1960, and most of our listeners didn't have politics in 1960, the fact of the matter is it was an incredibly high-level debate, and you ask yourself as you listen to it, would the American public sit still for that conversation today? And I think the answer is no, they wouldn't, partly because it seemed wonky, but I think partly because this 30-year holiday from history that we had, that I recall in the book, as we ignored the signs from Russia of Putin saying clearly what he was going to go do, as we thought about China in terms that were perfectly reasonable at the time, that it would seek to wrap itself into Western-based markets, but would not challenge us. I think that sort of dulled our sense of thinking about what the nation needs to do to stay economically competitive, stay competitive in semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum, and then also how to spend less money and still be more militarily competitive. And that's the combination we need to be debating, and we're not doing it.
So Chip, let me weigh in there, because I'm with David on this. I could certainly wax eloquent on external threats, and we could talk about China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, and that would be a valid discussion. But we can't fight off those external threats if we continue to be as divided and polarized and, quite frankly, as fact averse as we are right now. So the threats coming from inside the house. I mean, we just saw a Supreme Court argument, which, blew my mind. We've had a Supreme Court argument about whether or not we should have a king or a tyrant or an authoritarian in the Oval Office, and whether or not whoever occupies that seat should have immunity for acts and that put him and we should put him above, or her above, the law. The fact that we're at this point in our nation is exhibit A, that we've got a problem here. And if we had another 9/11, it would immediately be politicized. The blame game would start. We would not come together as a nation or agree on anything. We can't agree on defending democracy and what our role is around the world doing that and championing the cause of free people. So we managed to politicize a global pandemic. And so we're at a place right now where I worry most about America's ability to defend itself from ourselves and from external threats.
How much of that is political, do you guys think? In other words, like, we see these kids on college campuses. My niece can't go to her classes today at Cal because of the protests of what's going on. And and I have friends that live in Israel, and when I look at that and I say to myself, how can there be such a huge disconnect from what Hamas did? Sure, the IDF's reaction was strong, but if Hamas stops, this whole thing ends, right? If Hamas decides, I mean, most people that live in this country seem to be protected by that Mark Twain axiom of our greatest defense is the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Of course, that's all changed, and we saw it on 9/11. I mean, is this partly messaging to the world about these dangers and what people have to do? They have to grow up and wake up. Is some of that true?
Well, if you're looking for me first, so first of all, we start with the fact that our greatest protections here are our First Amendment protections. And, I'm always struck by the fact that in the United States, the people who talk about the Second Amendment the most talk about the First Amendment the least, and vice versa. My own view, not surprising after 40 years in journalism, is there's a reason the First Amendment is first. And so I think what you are seeing going on on the campuses in terms of the protests about the conditions of the Palestinians, the aid, the nature of the actions that we've seen taking place in 6 months after a absolutely horrific and unforgivable Hamas attack. But that part of it is completely First Amendment protected, and I don't think we should be shocked by campus protests. We all grew up with different points of campus protests, whether it was Vietnam or divestment from South Africa, which was a big deal when I was in college, and we've seen them on other issues. We have to separate that out from the acts of anti-Semitism and hate, which are different than free speech, right? And the problem that the universities are facing right now is they seem to be having an extraordinarily difficult time separating out First Amendment protected political speech, encampments, and action from active anti-Semitism threats and all that. And we need to learn how to separate those out. But to
Yeah.
your second point out here, it really gets back to this question of understanding how we think strategically. Once we get past these internal divisions, or maybe on top of these internal divisions, there is a legitimate debate to be had in the United States about how engaged with the rest of the world we need to be to push back on threats to the U.S. or to expand America's view of its own values, which we have done and overdone at various moments in our history. And for that, the purest piece of politics was the debate about extending the Ukraine aid bill that also included Taiwan and Israel and the Palestinians, and finally went through a few days ago and was signed into law by President Biden. I think the damage done by the 6 months or so in which we waited on that, and in which the Ukrainians lost ground unnecessarily, in which we interrupted the flow of ammunition and all that, maybe it's recoverable. Maybe it will turn out that that did huge damage to the Ukrainian cause. It certainly made our allies wonder whether or not, no matter who gets elected, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden getting reelected, whether or not we are going to be a reliable partner in the future. And that part of the message has been lost because Americans suffer from what H.R. McMaster wonderfully called strategic narcissism, which is we think it's all about us. And the fact of the matter is we create some vacuums and other nations fill in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if we can't, we can't make a decision on whether we're going to defend free people from an adversary, by the way. There are strategic reasons why we should be aiding Ukraine. And it's not just about Ukraine. It's about the fact that we have an opportunity here to degrade an adversary that wants to hurt us and our allies. And we are, there's tremendous success happening in terms of degrading Russian military capabilities. And we should recognize it for what it is and not be afraid to call it that. People are afraid of, it's the phrase proxy war. Well, by God, would you rather have American boots on the ground in Ukraine doing this? And Lord help us.
This is a really important point, because I think something people lose in the way President Biden has conducted this war, and the book, as you will read, is highly critical of how they did the Afghan withdrawal. It also makes the argument, and I'd be interested to see whether or not you guys agree with this, that the failure in Afghanistan actually forced Biden's team to come together and helps explain why they did the Ukraine response so well, which included huge pressure on the Russians, sanctions, gathering NATO together, arms shipments, but no American boots on the ground. Now, we don't know if we'll be able to preserve that, because if the Russians move on and actually attack into NATO territory, we would be treaty obligated. And that's one of the big differences in this election. You heard what former President Trump said about his view, what he would tell the Russians if they invaded a country that he didn't think had paid up sufficiently in their NATO, what he calls dues, but what is not in fact dues. But I do think one of the central differences between these two candidates is a very different vision of the value of alliances and a very different vision of whether the United States should be pushing back in cases like this. And I just like to, part of the reason I wrote the book was to try to lay out the costs and differences as we compete with both China and Russia simultaneously, which is why this book is called New Cold Wars with an S at the end. This is not what we experienced from the late 1940s through to the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is a far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more volatile set of international situation than we faced in the somewhat predictable Cold War.
When you study the way people react under stress, sometimes it's counterintuitive. I read a story about a psychological study of people living in London during the Blitzkrieg, right? And the closer the bombs came, the tighter the people were, and actually, in a lot of ways, their optimism and their spirit drove them to come together and to work more efficiently. And I thought about that, how we were after 9/11, and I look at the way that Americans respond to domestic as opposed to international problems. It seems to me that the airwaves are, I mean, most of our time we spend talking about inflation or, crime, the spree crime in San Francisco and all, but not so much attention to the things that really are a threat to us, as we're talking about right now until we come here. I saw Chris Wray talking about we're on high alert right now, that we're really worried about a domestic terror, which we haven't really had since 9/11. And I credit the FBI and all intelligence services for that. But I guess I go back to this. How important is it that Americans understand these threats and then influence our politicians, or like, Comer and Jordan, not to accept Russian disinformation and to listen? I heard, Congressman Turner talking about that on Jake Tapper, saying my party's full of Russian propaganda. It starts with that, doesn't it? I mean, this kind of going back to the perfect weapon is that, spreading this disinformation and these seeds of unrest and fear that people are powerless is a really destructive tool, a psychological tool. And does that play out here at all?
It does some. The Perfect Weapon was a book about the revival or the rise of cyber as a instrument for states to go influence each other. And of that, the one that you're identifying, disinformation, is one, and I would say only one, of the four major forms of cyber disruption. I mean, the first is obviously just the theft of intellectual property, what you saw China do for years, how they took the F-35 design, but I could name 100 other examples. The second is the use of cyber to go do something that previously the US or others could only do with saboteurs, right? So that would be interrupting critical infrastructure, what you guys were just discussing at the opening. And that's what we did, the United States and Israel did, to the Iranian nuclear centrifuges in Operation Olympic Games, which was revealed in that book and a previous one. The third major way you can do this is, ransomware, the kind of mix of criminal and state activity. And the fourth is disinformation. And it's interesting because in the 2016 election, only the Russians were significant players. In 2020, it was the Russians and the Iranians. In 2024, it's going to be the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese. And just a few hours ago, in an interview with CNN, Secretary of State Tony Blinken said that he was seeing evidence now of Chinese interference for the first time. The U.S. has not made public its evidence. We've written things about other examples. That is accelerated by cyber, but it's not triggered by cyber. I don't know if you've got a different view, but.
Look, that we've been getting bolder and bolder language coming from the intelligence community, and I'm particularly focused on very strong language coming from FBI Director Chris Wray with regard to China. And of course, as we've already talked about, he's raising the red flag right now about a potential international terror attack here on the homeland. But the China threat, I have never seen an FBI director this bold in his language and in coordination, by the way, with his counterpart in the UK. The head of MI5 they appeared together in London and really lashed out at China, warning all of us that an attack is coming. Ray has used a phrase saying something like China is poised to attack. Here's what that, from my 25 years in the Bureau and serving as assistant director, understand something. The director's not given license to say stuff like that unless the White House and the DOJ have approved it, and the DNI has approved it. This is a messaging that's warning us, number one. And number two, it's also a message to China that's saying, we are onto you. We know what you're doing, and we're calling it out. So This is eye-opening.
Now, I did not read his statement as being primarily about disinformation. I read his statement as being primarily about Volt Typhoon. And Volt Typhoon is the code name that has been given by American companies to the Chinese operation to put malware into utilities, into the water pipelines and so forth, particularly surrounding American military bases. And the theory, we don't know exactly what their motivation is. The theory of the case is that if there was a Taiwan incident, and I spend a lot of time in the book reporting from Taiwan, and you'll see discussion of the semiconductor industry and whether it creates a silicon shield against a Chinese invasion. But the primary purpose of this code, the intelligence community believes, is to slow a U.S. response if China went after Taiwan at some point in the future, and to create enough internal chaos in the U.S. from cutting off water and electricity, even if only temporarily, so that we would focus at home and not on what was happening on an island 3,000 miles away.
Yeah, that's preparing the battlefield, so to speak, or at least our ability to defend in the battlefield. And yeah, back to the propaganda issue for the election. NBC News had a great series of reports within the last week or two on the fact that the intel community is seeing a Chinese operation against the campaign already. They're doing something called spamouflage, Chip, which is, they're masquerading as your favorite mainstream or not news platform, and it looks like you're clicking on your CNN or whoever you watch, but it's not. It's the Chinese, and they've inserted a story which could be true. Somebody could have said Biden looks decrepit today, right. But what they've done is they put it on the front page of their fake their mainstream news platform, and you think it's real. It gets clicks, it gets amplified, and they are already doing this on a fairly large scale.
Yeah, you'd be amazed how many people aren't paying enough attention to see what's these. If you looked at this and concentrated on it for more than 3 seconds, you would say that isn't the news site I usually go to. The Russians have also adopted a much more subtle strategy. So think about 2016, where the Russian strategy was Prigozhin's internet research agency would create some fake news reports and try to get a pro-abortion or pro-Black Lives Matter demonstration going on one side of the street and an anti-one on the other side of the street. And, it was pretty transparent, didn't work so well, but, they were experimenting. They've discovered that it's fairly easy for the U.S. to detect, identify, and for the internet, providers to block those. So what they're doing now is basically amplifying protected free speech of Americans, so that if somebody comes out and says something wild about Joe Biden or something wild about Donald Trump or something wild on a social issue or whatever, and they find it to their advantage, they will then find different platforms to amplify that, which is very subtle because you can't clamp down on somebody's original First Amendment right, as we were discussing about the encampments and the campuses the other at the beginning of this discussion. So they have learned very well how to go take the American system and use it against itself. And we have to be very, very skillful in how we respond to that, because the temptation to destroy the fundamental rights that are critical to it, because it's the most efficient way to block the amplification of the message, is probably not the right way to go.
David, what would you say to us about the platforms, the various platforms, Google, X, et cetera, willingness and capacity to identify and take down those attempts by Russia and China, particularly posting fake news accounts, but inserting real stories?
Willingness high, and actually most of the best research that we have seen come out on just this phenomena has come from the Microsoft Digital Crimes Group. In the opening of the book, you will find a Microsoft unit that's just outside Dulles Airport that provided the first warning that the Russian attack on Ukraine was about to happen, because they saw the malware being activated that had been placed by the Russians into the Ukrainian government offices. And of course, they took down Viasat, the European satellite system that Ukraine depended on. So I find that Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple have been very attuned by and large. But when you're doing something as subtle as I was just discussing, it's not easy to bring everything down, because as you bring down the spamophlies, you also have to be careful not to bring down the original protected political speech, even if it's a form of, even if it's a message in which you deeply, deeply disagree. And that's the core of our First Amendment privileges. You know?
Reminds me a little bit of Orson Welles' Martian invasions. You know, like today we have that on 100 websites, right? And so many people are trained to go to one or two websites to get their news. And you know, without making this political, I think it's only fair, you know, to your point in your book about this new book, New Cold Wars, about Trump speaking to the CEO of AT&T and being bored by talking about Chinese infrastructure. I worry.
That was the best scene. I just saw Randall Stevenson the other day in Dallas. He was kind enough to come and have a discussion with me about the book. But Randall was at the time the CEO of AT&T, and he goes into the Oval Office. It may be the funniest single page of the book. Okay, and he's going in with his general counsel on a really serious issue, which is what kind of Chinese infrastructure can we allow to have built in the United States? What can we live with? What can we police? What can we ban? You know, it's an extension of what has become the TikTok debate here now, but this was more about network hardware. I can't think of anything more central to American security for the reasons again. And Trump at one point, a few minutes into it, says, "This is really boring." and he immediately then turns the discussion to Stormy Daniels.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the thing about this is, and I go back to, again, you know, if you want to manipulate America, manipulate the public, right? I mean, it's like the same in anywhere. I mean, if right now, I don't know what percentage I read in a couple of studies, a Quinnipiac poll about the deep state, how many people actually believe there is a deep state and what that actually means. And you can quickly go from the deep state to atomic pizza. I mean, we saw it happen right in front of us. And I wonder when, you know, when we hear stories about this, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole here, but this is a perfect storm. A president with this high level of incompetence, and I speak to the former president, it poses a real danger to America. But I would imagine when Mark Milley called the Chinese on January 6th, purportedly, to tell them, hey, we got control, don't worry about it. Part of me thinks that they were sitting back watching it in glee.
Yeah. So what was interesting about January 6th is that the Russians took that film and broadcast it around the world to say, see, this is the American vaunted democracy. You know, it was basically to undercut our image. And like I said, this is the classic example of how the biggest threat is us. We gave them the material, right? But the Chinese took it and broadcast it internally to say, I know you all are protesting about the need for more democracy in China and all that. This is what you get. You get social chaos.
Probably like we did with Tiananmen Square, right? I mean,
yeah, I mean, that was a straight on authoritarian, you know, crackdown, but it was also in a pre-internet age, right? I was still living in Asia during that time and was in and out of China a fair bit. And, you know, it passed around a lot, but on traditional television.
But I can't let you go without talking about Iran and what's going on right now with Israel and Iran and how we worry about this. You know, I hear a lot about this as Archduke Ferdinand. This is 1917, and how people worry about this kind of conflagration spreading across Europe. And I saw J.D. Vance, again, to take this one step further, J.D. Vance on with Jake Tapper saying Republicans don't believe that Russia would go through Ukraine into Poland and destroy NATO, despite Trump's comments about you can do whatever the hell you want. I guess I look at the Middle East, and right now that's for a 1,000 years we've had these issues. Is this? It seems to have settled down. The market's kind of responded in a positive way, like, "Oh, good, this is kind of over." And I thought to myself, "This is so far from over." And how Saudi Arabia and these other countries are responding. Where are we in this crisis right now?
So you've got two big challenges with Iran, and after this, I've got to run to something. But the challenge is this: on the one hand, they are obviously financing a good deal of the unrest you're seeing in the Middle East. They financed Hamas, Hezbollah. They've also financed over the years the operatives who are coming out of Yemen. So this has been, an axis of disruption, and they call it the axis of resistance, right? Resisting the United States. The most important geopolitical development we've had that I trace in the book is the coming together of Russia, China, and Iran in an uneasy partnership. These are not countries that get along naturally, particularly the Russians and the Chinese, but who have joined together in some ways because they are united by their opposition to a Western dominated and Western designed set of rules, Western dominated world. And that's going to be the structure of the next 30 or 40 years. I remind people that in 2015, when we negotiated, the United States negotiated a deal with Iran that got rid of 97% of their nuclear material, the Russians and the Chinese were on the US and European side of the negotiating table through that entire 15, 16 months of negotiations, which I was covering for the Times. If you held those negotiations today, well, first of all, you wouldn't be able to hold them today. But second, if you could, the Russians and the Chinese would not be on the US side of the table. And that gives you a sense in the past 9 years how radically this has altered and how much we are into a very different kind of Cold War than the one that we were accustomed to.
Huh. Hey, well, best of luck with this book.
Thank you.
It's timely, of course, and I have a feeling that it'll be timely in 10 years or maybe 100.
Chip, congratulations is due to David for already appearing. The book's already on the New York Times bestseller list, so congrats.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Right. Well, David, thank you so much. Can we get you back sometime in the near future?
Anytime, you guys give a call.
Thank you again.
Thanks, David.
Pulitzer Prize winning David Sanger, New York Times correspondent in Washington, D.C. We'll catch you next time, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Interesting. It's you guys both have such a unique perspective on this. And this is kind of the point I keep trying to drive home. I was living in D.C. My house was maybe half a mile from the first sniper shooting. And they all were sent right in that part of Montgomery County. They were all around my house. In Montgomery County, one of the largest, most populous counties in America, they actually shut down Montgomery County and had a phalanx of cops if you were trying to leave the county after the third shooting. They literally shut the county down. I was trying to get to Baltimore to work when I lived in D.C. I worked in Baltimore, and I couldn't leave the county. It took a long time. It was remarkable. When people talk about 9/11, and the paralysis that it caused our country and the victory that bin Laden could have never expected, that we attacked ourselves, right? But that small act of terror that was just a psychological aberration, but it shut down. It had people done that across the country, I believe you would have had the kind of paralysis that they're all looking for. I think the American psyche is fragile, very fragile, and it can be damaged very easily. And that, to me, plays in the back part of this whole national security dilemma we have from inside our borders.
For sure. I mean, you've cited an example there with the snipers in Montgomery County and shutting down. There's an example of a readily identifiable threat, immediate public and law enforcement response, public cheering on law enforcement. Let's catch this guy or guys who are doing this. People are dying. And we're all there for that. And today, fast forward today, I don't know. I truly don't know. First of all, we've got sheriff's offices around the country that are highly politicized, elected sheriffs who decide they're not enforcing certain laws. They're not going to do it. So, the public will quickly politicize anything that happens. And so, the question we started off this hour with was, where's the threat? What's the greatest threat? And here we are talking about the threat is us. And we've got to get that together before we move on and talk about the external threats, or we can't fight them.
And without politicizing it, obviously we did run into chaos in the teens, and it coincided with Trump's election. I think there were a lot of groups already that were dissatisfied with either the current political agenda or the fact that the economic agenda had not found them. I mean, isn't it true generally that that crime goes down when the economy gets better, or is that just it does? Yeah.
No, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the part I think that a lot of, it's in my head, the politics of this is that how do you keep a lot of people happy at the same time? Well, you do it by strengthening the economy. I go back to Carville's famous statement. It's the economy, stupid.
The economy, stupid. And look, it's a large part of America has bought into this lie that number one, crime is up, and number two, the economy is horrible. And again, we're back to really not being able to digest and process facts. Crime is not up. Violent crime is down. The economy is not horrible. But yes, I'm upset about how much it costs to go out to the diner for breakfast because it's outrageous, right? So, we've got jobs doing well, market doing well, and people don't want to hear it. They hear what they want to hear and disregard the rest, to quote from Simon and Garfunkel.
I was thinking about is seeing these smash and grab crimes, and and like in places like Walgreens or Apple stores or whatever. And then, of course, the media puts it happens a lot in San Francisco, but still a lot is not a lot, but just 2 or 3 on television give you the sense that it's happening everywhere all the time. I love these stories too of these kids that are working there for minimum wage, and they tackle these guys when they see them trying to leave with carrying a stereo or something, and then they're fired, right? Because insurance companies don't want them doing this. And I think there's still a strong part of the American culture is like, you talk about something that's cohesive. The thing that brings us all together, I think, in a way, is like those people are nobody's hero, right? These people that run in and steal this stuff, and they want to see somebody stand up to them. And I think it's in some cases we're still Lord of the Flies, Frank. We're not this unified sort of complex structure that comes together. We're still a little, but I think there are some underlying characteristics that the American psyche still holds. And one of them is justice, and sometimes swift justice, as Trump likes to talk about, we want it done. So, most Americans feel that way, that, right or wrong, they want to see justice happen. And they want to see it doled out quickly. Whatever, when we hear trials, like the fact that this, I can't remember his name, the guy that killed his wife and was convicted in San Francisco, and now he's got a new trial. And people are like, come on, man. Time and time again, we hear these stories, Harry, the Hollywood guy, was just Weinstein. Thank you. To see his case overturned. I think there's just, and I know that but people do feel a sense of, and I think this fuels a lot of the dissension in the country right now, a sense of like, nothing's working anymore.
Yeah, I think, Chip, your point's well taken, because we tend not to try to understand each other enough in this country. And a large part of what we're experiencing here, and boy, there's many components to the MAGA movement, but one of them is exactly that, which is we don't think things are working. I don't like the price of this. I don't like the fact that, we've got to go through 1,000 appeals before some violent criminal is actually convicted. And things get overturned. The Harvey Weinstein thing, that's outrageous. The reason for that being overturned was, they were allowed to show past similar conduct at his trial, and now we have an appellate court going, no, you shouldn't have done that. Well, we were allowed to do it. You can show past similar conduct. So people are fed up, and we shouldn't just sit back on our respective sides and say, I don't get those other people. I don't understand anything about them. No, you do actually, because you share some of the same frustrations, but the difference is we've got to insert facts in that. And I think one of those, for example, is what's going on college campuses right now. University of Texas, Austin, massive protests immediate on Hamas, Gaza, the plight of the Palestinian people now. And here comes Governor Abbott of Texas ordering his state troopers to move in and start arresting students immediately. Well, Governor Abbott, what are you arresting the students for? Quote, hate speech, unquote. Okay, hold on a minute. What? And so where is that charge on the books? And of course, it's just come out in the news that all of those students' charges have been dropped because what they were arrested for, because cops know there's nothing in the Texas code that's called hate speech. It's called free speech. And so they arrested them for trespass, and now it's all been dropped. So, this quick action, this macho alpha male response. Tom Cotton, senator, similarly said, hey, these folks who are blocking bridges around the country on the Palestinian issue, get out of your car and take matters into your own hands.
Oh,
Okay, Tom, are you going to pay for the lawsuit when I get arrested for assault and battery? Right? So simple solutions appeal to people who are looking to solve complex problems, but it doesn't work.
I mean, that's the hard part is, messaging to people that, you have some basic fundamental differences. How do you start that conversation? And I think that's why I would never even consider wanting to be president of the United States. Just, there's it's interesting, if you look at I remember Mayor O'Malley, Martin O'Malley. He ran for president in 2016 with Hillary, and he didn't win any didn't win any states, obviously, but he did well early on. And he was mayor of Baltimore, and he used to tell me that's like a mayor of a major American city today.
A very brief run. Now I've got it. Yeah.
And I saw it up close. You can't win. I mean, there's just so many, and it's a small area and so many warring factors. And I literally and metaphorically, looking at somebody that's in an elected position trying to negotiate crime and statistics and, the 5 years of The Wire, if anybody's ever seen that on television, you'll see it's so much about juking the stats politically. So they want an aggravated assault to knock down to simple assault, or they want, there's actually the book Homicide that David Simon wrote. You'll love this. The very first chapter, they find a dead homeless person on the border of Baltimore County and Baltimore City, but he's in the city. They dragged his body across the street and put it in the county to go on their stats, and this is the world that's being negotiated that the vast majority of Americans have no idea what's going on. I want to talk to you briefly about Chris Wray and this Nasser guy. And I don't know much about him. I assume you know him to some extent. I'm very impressed by his demeanor and his ability to take the heat. He seems to me like a guy that does that well. The FBI apparently did not act quickly enough on some of these claims that this wrestling instructor, what was his first name, Frank?
We're talking about Dr. Larry Nasser at USC?
Larry Nasser, yeah. This story is heartbreaking for any parent of a young child.
Yeah, here's the deal. And first, let me say this. I am keenly aware that lots of people have lots of issues with FBI Director Chris Wray, particularly around January 6th. And by the way, so do I. I'm not a staunch defender of Chris Wray, but I will, people who know me, follow me, I will say when the Bureau has screwed up, and then I'll say when they've done it right. And we have both present here in the case of Dr. Larry Nasser, for those not completely familiar with it. And I've got a column out this week on MSNBC Daily on this topic. Multiple USA gymnast athletes, some of the biggest names, including Simone Biles and others, came to the FBI and reported that they were being sexually molested by the team doctor, Larry Nasser. And that this was happening at multiple locations around the country. So there was travel involved. That's important for federal jurisdiction, right? For whatever reason, and boy, the reasons have started to come out now, the FBI played around with this and did nearly nothing for somewhere between 8 months and a year before things got serious about an investigation. Even USA Gymnastics came to the FBI and said, hey, listen, what's happening? We got to know. This guy's dirty. He's molesting our athletes.
And they were slow to act too, right? I mean,
oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah. And there's guilt. There's blame all around here. But this is where it gets really bad. This happened in Indianapolis, where USA Gymnastics is headquartered. The head of the FBI in Indianapolis happened to be applying for a job with the U.S. Olympic Committee. And that has been exposed during a DOJ Inspector General investigation. Moreover, nothing wrong with that, right? Everybody looks for that job past the FBI, but he lied about it to the Inspector General investigators during an official investigation. Nope, hadn't applied, no. And the supervisor over the case likewise lied to investigators. Material facts were omitted or lied about, covered up, and under the guise of, well, I think we're playing around with, we don't know about federal jurisdiction here, you know. Well, so Chris Wray comes out, and testifies before Congress. Look, this is a colossal screw up. I'm fed up with it, right? And he makes it right. They've implemented a number of policy changes and manual guidelines that mandate reporting to local police. If you're going to spend more than 2 minutes discussing federal jurisdiction and somebody's in active molestation, you've got to go to the local police and let them know what's going on while you play around with jurisdictional issues.
Did that not happen?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, ultimately, it was a female campus police officer at Michigan State that worked the case, took it seriously, because he had also been a team doctor at Michigan State. And she took it seriously. And ultimately, he was first arrested by state police. So that's how that happened. The other thing is, there's now time constraints put on responding to sexual assault allegations. You cannot wait. You've got to go. There's every 30 days, there's recurring reviews. A supervisor cannot sign out his own document. So if a supervisor says, I'm closing this case, and he authored the document and approved the document, that's no longer the case. So they did it right. But in my column, I come out very strongly, Chip, and I say these two agents, the head of the Indianapolis FBI office, who's now no longer with the Bureau, that's another problem. He retired as soon as he came under investigation, or before they could even investigate him. The supervisor is no longer with the FBI, but they should have been prosecuted for lying to Inspector General agents. They were not. It was declined by Department of Justice. And that's yet another injustice to those young ladies who were victimized by Nassar and now victimized by the system. And DOJ announced this week a $138 million settlement with the victims. At least 40 of those victims were molested in the gap in time between their reporting to the FBI and something being done about it. 40 young ladies were continued to be molested. And now it's our taxpayer dollars, yours and mine, helping to pay this settlement for a DOJ FBI screw up.
Reminds me a little bit of the Sandusky Penn State thing that took so long and people just didn't want to believe it. And the FBI cannot operate without help of local law enforcement. Obviously local law enforcement gives them the lay of the land. They have the connections. There's been some acrimony between the feds and state occasionally when, especially when locals feel they have a hold on it and the federal government comes in for political reasons or for reasons that, in a case like this, saying somebody molested children is a pretty big crime. It's a pretty serious issue. It reminds me of the McMartin case years ago, where it turns out there were no molestations and there were just a lot of charges. And so a lot of people tiptoe around that. Yes. And it's a very difficult thing to do. Yes. But when you had this high a number, you would have liked to think that the committee that had jurisdiction over these young girls and, the instructors, you would have thought maybe they had the first message and they would have gone directly to the FBI, and the FBI then would have gone back to the local jurisdictions to do this. What was the key thing in here how did it get so foobarred? What was the thing that really caused this case to be overlooked by the FBI?
Yeah, so a perfect storm of jurisdictional questions. Let's go to the U.S. Attorney's Office and talk for days about whether it's federal or not. Is this true? You mentioned the McMartin case. Could this be manufactured? Could it be young people just not understanding? And then the study of this so-called medical technique he claimed he was using, which, by the way, he actually videotaped the technique. He thought he had something that involved absolute molestation and penetration with his hand, if not his entire arm, by the way, to so-called adjust the spine or the pelvis, right? And these young girls thought, I don't know, it's the team doctor. I guess he's supposed to be doing this.
Yeah.
So lots of that and hand wringing. And then look, let's call it what it is. There's some integrity and ethics issues here with the head of an FBI office who, it's drilled into us, Chip, when you're at the executive level. You've got to go through an ethics officer at headquarters to say, I'm now looking for retirement jobs. I'm now talking to this organization or that, and I am going to recuse myself from anything to do with those places. I'm not making any decisions regarding that. I did it myself when I was eligible for retirement. I had companies were coming to me saying, would you work for us? I ran to the ethics officer and I said, I want you to know I'm talking to these people and I won't touch anything to do with them investigatively.
Unfortunately, that doesn't apply in the financial world. People at SEC can go one day from there to Goldman Sachs the next day. And it's, some issues there.
That's wrong.
Let me, before we go, I want to talk a little bit about long haul. And I think this is a really important point that Americans, that we kind of have gone through this whole show. Americans are not fully aware of many of the dangers that surround them. I think that the response to COVID and now we're looking at the possibility of, although it's remote, of person-to-person bird flu transmission, which would be like the Black Plague. I mean, it's really hard. I mean, people, I talk about the Black Plague to people. It took 400 years for the population to return to where it was in Europe after that happened. We're still the same human beings, and these opportunities for viruses are still out there. So the reaction to that, to me, that's one of my greatest worries, even above nuclear war or that kind of attack, is to have another COVID, but on steroids. SARS and MERS had death rates in the 30s to 40%. I mean, really high, but they weren't as communicable. Had they been, smallpox has a high death rate and very communicable, but we came up with a vaccine for that.
But we're anti-vax now, Chip. So
did you see Aaron Rodgers the other day said he thought HIV was created by the government? These are the kind of, we're giving these people a position.
Yeah.
So
and what RFK, who's anti-vax, is polling at 11% in some places.
Yeah. I spent a good part of the 80s on the road. I was a traveling musician, and I drove almost 1 million miles in 11 years. So I saw and I got to know a lot of truckers. I would see guys, I drove like 300 or 400 miles a day, Frank. So it was crazy. But I got to know a lot of people on the road. I truck stops. I really took showers, place to take showers. I would take the money that the colleges gave me for a hotel and put it in pocket, hit the road and stop and get a shower someplace. It was that kind of life. And so when you told me about, the book you were working on, honestly, I was a little shocked. It's called Long Haul, and the title itself is intriguing. The subtitle is the actual intriguing part, Hunting the Highway Serial Killers. So we're talking about serial killers that prey along the nation's interstates. First of all, before we get into the weeds on that, where did you get this idea? How did you hear about this?
So, people already are asking me, Frank, is this something you worked on in the FBI? No. And you know why? I didn't know the initiative existed. The FBI has a highway serial killings initiative based out of its behavioral analysis program stationed at Quantico. I found out about it after I retired. I found out about it from talking to the head of the initiative, and I stopped in my tracks when she said, yeah, my job is I head up the highway serial killings initiative. And I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And she proceeded to tell me there are at least 850 homicides, mostly of sex-trafficked women, along our nation's highways that are committed largely by long-haul truckers. And the numbers are rising. This is not a history book I've written. This is an active, real-time problem. And so being this kind of natural investigator that I am, I said, I've got to know more about this. And I felt compelled to write the book and to share what I've learned. So it's a deep dive, Chip, into 3 cultures. So I rode over 2,000 miles on the road with a big rig trucker. We were in a flatbed. I slept in that sleeper berth. I was showering at truck stops like you've just talked about. I wanted to learn the trucker culture. And what I learned was fascinating. Namely about how great the trucking industry is, and
these guys work their asses off, right?
Oh my God, it's and most of them are career and family people. There's men and women putting food on their tables by putting food on our tables.
They're away from home so much. It's really it's a difficult and dangerous out there.
It's brutal. It's dangerous. I learned we had a lot of near misses while I was riding, meaning you and I got to stay clear of a truck and give them plenty of leeway. They cannot stop on a dime for sure. So I learned a lot about trucking. So that's the first culture. The second culture I take a deep dive into is trafficking, the victims. And I got on the road. I spoke with survivors and even thrivers from the life of trafficking and being trafficked to truckers specifically and surviving violent encounters. So if you're sitting there going, look, I have young ladies in my family, I have daughters, I have granddaughters. None of this is ever going to happen to them. I've got a different story for you. I get deep into how a young lady, a girl, will fall into the trap of trafficking. And if you think it's a stranger abduction, this gets lots of news. It's a stranger abduction. The girl disappears and she's been trafficked for years now. That's rare. It's someone on the periphery of her friendship network, often online now, that's going to get her recruited into selling her body for sex. That's how it happens. I talked to the top 2 national experts on street level trafficking who gave me the formula, the commonalities on how you get to the trafficking trap. And then I spoke to the top crime analysts who happen to be women, by the way. That's important here because they give a damn about their female victims. I talked to the head of the FBI's program, talked to the lady who actually started this whole thing 40 years ago and was the first one to say, we've got a problem with murder and truckers. She was an Oklahoma State crime analyst. So, and then I offer solutions, Chip. I didn't want to write a book that scares the hell out of you.
Real quick, because before if you honestly forget to say it, that some of the heroes in this book are truckers.
Oh yeah, thank you. Because there's a group called TAT, Truckers Against Trafficking, that actually trains up long haul truckers to identify, to report trafficking as they see it. They are the eyes and the ears, and they give awards out every year to hero truckers these are like, church going, good, solid people that want to keep the roads safe. They work their butt off. And I'm, some of the other people that for whatever reason, Ann Rule used to tell me about sitting next to Ted Bundy for a year and having no clue at all. That's what an incredible psychopath he was. There are people around us that are like that, that have that capability. But there's always, this as law enforcement, they make mistakes, and the mistakes they make are often mistakes because of their sociopathy or whatever, that you go, whoa, something's wrong about that. It just feels wrong. And you guys operate on that all the time as law enforcement, right? We do get deep in the book. I get deep into certainly the mistakes that are made by killers that get them caught. But I also get deep into how you work a crime scene when it's suspected serial killing. I get into the worst of the most heinous killers and crimes committed out there. And at the end of the book, I make a point of ending on a positive note that there is survival and thriving after you get out of this life as a victim of trafficking. I feature some amazing work, Chip, that's being done with young women to get them back on their feet, established in the community. And I talk about possible solutions to lessen the number of murders by truckers on the road. So it's a little bit of everything for everyone, but I've already had people saying, hey, it's going to be my Father's Day gift. I've had truckers and truckers' wives approach me and say, I'm glad you've written this because it is some of our reality on the road. So I'm looking forward to getting out across America and talking about the book.
Well, I've read it. It's great stuff. And, you know, I love, you know, it's different than crime fiction, obviously, because these are all true stories. And what's happening currently now, as you said before, this is not the history. This is also the future. It's a combination of our vulnerability, but also I think in some ways, stories like this get people more fired up. My wife was not a political animal until 2015, even though we grew up together in DC and we knew a lot of the players. We knew, you know, one of my best friends was a former press secretary for a U.S. senator. And so we were like in the middle of all that. I worked on Capitol Hill as a kid. But it's interesting when, you know, having a father that was law enforcement, I saw the difficulty it was on families and people like yourself that have to carry this burden of, you know, trying to find these people. It's difficult. I mean, and with these truckers, their jobs, you know, that's one of the reasons I know that you were so, and I saw one of your videos online where you're saying, we love you guys, you know, so understand this is not an attack on truckers. This is actually a defense of the truckers. There's so many good people out there that are trying to stop these bad people that, you know, that navigate their way through all parts of our lives. So I find it interesting. You know, I would love, one of the things that bothered me about January 6th was the Capitol Hill policemen that were beaten, you know, and how that got thrown aside. These guys, they were standing up against 2,000 or 3,000 people. Politics aside, these people were angry and whatever they were trying to do, and they're screaming about hurting people. And these cops were, you know, do what cops do every day. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot here comes into national security. You know, we're trying to come up with a subline for Frankly. And one of the things I mentioned to you was, you know, a hard look at soft spots, but I wouldn't say we're soft. You know, maybe a hard look at national security. I just think, you know,
we've got soft spots though. We've got them, and we've got to own up to them and identify those soft spots. To an extent, long haul is about a soft spot
right
on our nation's highways.
Maybe that's what we should call this show then, huh?
Yeah, I think so. I think we are talking about what to name our show.
In the future, I would like to, I've reached out to actually a couple former Klansmen who have turned their lives around and have a good, interesting look at what's happening in this country. Also, you know, the idea of, you know, kind of revisiting what David's first book was about, cyber warfare. And so people can understand our vulnerability. TikTok, of course, it looks like it's going to be banned now. Have you heard anything about that? What's your sense on that? Is it a smart move?
Well, yes. Yeah, I don't think people fully understand the gravity of the threat from TikTok as it remains in Chinese hands. It is a way to cause you that, you know, maybe you're that young college student saying, well, who cares? I'm dancing on TikTok. What's the problem? You become that weak link, that soft spot, and your college's server or cloud that allows China in, right? So they may not care so much about your dancing and your data, but you've just let them in to a larger university setting. Same thing happening everywhere. And the Chinese are masters at collecting volumes of data and using it later. So there is a threat there. Do I think they're going to sell? I mean, the condition here is that for TikTok to remain in the United States, they've got to sell to a non-China owner. We'll see. We'll see.
We'll have more on that next week, and maybe try to get somebody to talk a little more in depth on that with us as well. There's so much here, and it's good for us, but it's also kind of bad for the world that there's so many national security issues. Frank Figliuzzi, his new book, Long Haul, is available for pre-order. When is the release date?
So you'll get it on May 28th. That's the launch, but you can pre-order right now on Amazon or anywhere you pre-order books, and then you'll guarantee that you'll have it on May 28th.
It's a great read. All right, I'm Chip Franklin. We'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much for joining us on Frankly, a hard look at America's soft spots. That's our current one. All right, be well.